The results are in, and as an American society, it appears as if we get a failing grade when it comes to educating our kids. According to a 2025 Gallup poll, it revealed that only 35% of Americans are satisfied with the educational quality of K through 12 education, which is a record low. 1 in 5 Americans believe that the quality of education is either excellent or good at preparing today's students for the modern workplace. Furthermore, an estimated 32% of American students were estimated to be behind grade level in at least one academic subject during the 2023 and 24 school year, according to a survey commissioned by the National Center for Education Statistics. One man on a mission to ensure that American kids receive a brighter educational outcome is my friend Jeff McCoy. He helps K through 12 senior leaders and innovation solution providers transform systems and co-design better solutions through strategic research and development, thought leadership, and real-world district partnerships. He serves as the Chief Education Officer at Education Research and Development Institute. They're the premier provider of unique research and development opportunities for companies who are designing products and services for pre-K to 12 education. Their work lies at the intersection of creating a rich and meaningful forum for educational leaders and innovators to collaboratively work to discuss the future of pre-K to 12 education. And McCoy joined me this week to tell me more about how we can have a more level playing field in education and how research and development can serve as a valuable catalyst to improving the future quality of education. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Jeff, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, my friend, and I'm super excited to talk about education innovation with you. Great to see you, and happy Thursday to you, my friend.
Yeah, likewise.
You know what, Jeff, I'm interested to start our conversation by asking you how you believe we can close the education equity wealth gap, my friend, because depending on what side of the country you live on, education can be good, it can be poor, it can be somewhere in between. So I'm curious to ask you about how we can make education more inclusive and accessible for more students. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Well, I think that's a great question, Kevin. I think if you can solve that, then you probably would be a wealthy person at the end of the day. But I think there are a lot of districts making great strides to do just that within their own districts. You know, I think if you're looking at some innovative districts around the country, they're really diving into the data like Greenville did when I was in Greenville, really diving into the data to look at what groups of students aren't being successful. And it was really for us when we started really looking at and diving down granularly into the data is when we kind of started making some progress with closing some of those achievement gaps, closing some of those equity gaps, if you will. Particularly for students, for us, it was particularly for students of poverty. That was when we looked across the system. That was the group of students that were struggling the most in performance and achievement. And so really when we looked at that group of students, we were able to then, once we realized the problem, we were actually able to put some things in place, some strategies in place, some supports in place to help those students become more successful in the student outcomes and achievement.
Yeah, and I know that in your current role, my friend, you assist and help K-12 educators and leaders of both innovation and solution-oriented providers of education to transform systems and co-design better solutions for students through strategic and research development and leadership development, my friend. So tell me about your current work and the impact that it's making, my friend.
Yeah, so it's, this role for me is fairly new. I retired from Greenville County Schools about 3 months ago, and joined the ERDI team, which has been in business for about 40 years now. But our goal has been for that past 40 years was really to help companies, connect companies and educators together, but really help companies build better solutions for the needs of K-12 students. In my previous role as associate superintendent, we relied heavily, not always for core instruction, but we relied heavily on some of our solution provider partners to really help in that tier 2 and tier 3 instruction for students who might be struggling. Certainly, sometimes in the realm for us, when we start talking about, I know there's a question later on about students with disabilities. When we talk about for students with disabilities, for example, some of the assistive technologies we were able to put in place to really help our students overcome some of their challenges, ultimately made their education experience better and more successful for them. So as a company, that's kind of what we're all about. We're all about connecting those educators and solution providers, and how do we help solution providers build better products that K-12 environments need to help students be more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff, in your current role, I'm curious if your definition of education innovation has changed, and what have you learned as the Chief Education Officer at the Education Research and Development Institute about the importance of always evolving in education? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Well, I definitely think that is the case. I think right now, in the age of AI, particularly, education is going through a great evolving, if you will, and trying to figure out, what role does AI play in education, particularly as it relates to preparing students for their futures in the industry that they may go into as a career, or whether it be college that they're going into. So I think one of the things we attempt to do when we bring people together, some of the best and brightest around the country, we always say we're stronger together. One of the things we open up every institute or symposium that we have is with a quote that says, the smartest person in the room is the room. So we're stronger when we're solving problems together instead of individual silos across the country. So that's what we attempt to do, that we attempt to innovate together. And share those innovations and successes so that everybody's not recreating the wheel and making that iteration process even longer, but rather learn from each other's successes and also learn from each other's failures, so we're not making those same mistakes.
Yeah, and as a former district leader, I'm curious how you view the role of teachers today, because oftentimes, depending on the school district you work for, teachers are asked to be much more than the educator, often the psychologist or someone to lean on for their students. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how teachers have really become champions of innovation in terms of reaching their students to where they are today, my friends. And tell me about the role of teachers becoming today's innovators. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
So I would say, I always say I had multiple jobs in my 26-year career in Greenville, and I started as a teacher. I'll still always say one of the hardest jobs I had was a teacher. I think that teaching is one of the hardest jobs that exists because of what you just cited. Teachers have to be everything to every student. They have to be, in many cases, that mental health counselor almost sometimes. They have to be the one to make sure the students have, the basic needs met in the classroom before they can learn. They've got, 30 kids in a classroom with varying levels of where they're at in the curriculum or in the space or what gaps they've had. And so I think teachers are some of the most creative people I've come across. I've spent thousands of hours in classrooms in my own district and other districts around the country. And I'm always surprised what teachers do in the creativity aspect. I think today with innovation and AI particularly, I'm watching teachers become even more creative because they have tools now that can actually allow them to do things they weren't able to do in the past. They can create things quicker, a lot of times with AI, which actually frees them up time. The ones that are using it effectively, that actually frees them up for time to spend more time with kids, which is the goal of every teacher, is to be able to spend more time with their kids. So I think that AI innovation and evolution that we're in right now is allowing teachers to even take their creativity to a whole new level to design activities and for their students to be more successful.
Yeah, and I'm also curious to ask you about, education, the economic impact of becoming teachers, because, the running theme is, Jeff, that you don't go into teaching primarily for the money, but I know it's important to both you and I that teachers are paid fairly for the work that they're asked to do today. So what do you think it'll take from your lens as a former district leader to close the economic gap and really economically reward teachers for all the great work that they do? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, so I think that's another question, Kevin. It's a great question. I think something we as district leaders have always grappled with. I think most district leaders and folks would say teachers are vastly underpaid for the work that they do in the classrooms and what they're expected to do in the classrooms. I would say that, for us, I can only speak for, some of the districts like Greenville that really, when it comes to budget time, the first thing they look at is teacher raises. How do we keep pace with inflation? How do we just make sure that we can actually give them the cost of living increases that they deserve and should get through that budget cycle. But as you kind of allude to, unlike corporate America, we have less control over our budgets. We are in a finite budget based on state or federal budgets that come down to us. So we don't always have full control over that. But I think a lot of times districts, that is where districts prioritize their money because we know that's the biggest impact. The biggest impact on student achievement is going to be your teachers. So keeping those teachers in a classroom, especially in a time where we're in teacher shortages, is a critical component that is top of mind for all of us.
Yeah, and Jeff, I recently had a conversation with the Tennessee Commissioner of Human Services, and one of the things he talked about was the need to diversify the way we define employment success and education. And what I mean by that is Commissioner Carter talked about the importance of valuing, vocational rehabilitation schools and trade schools as another mark of education achievement and success. So I'm curious to get your opinion on the role of vocational trade schools and how they can help diversify not only the education system but the workforce as well. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
So that's another area I'd say, Kevin, I have had, a lot of experience and exposure to my last 10 years when I was in Greenville. I would say that, I'm very happy the last maybe 5 years, 6 years that the attitude towards trade schools, if you will, or career has really shifted. It used to be that everybody pushed every kid to college. Like you had to go to college, you had to go to college, you had to go to college. And that was for years I remember being really the big push. And I'm happy at least to say in most districts that I'm in, and in Greenville included, that shift really, a couple years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, really started shifting towards college and or career. We in Greenville have a big business space. We have a lot of advanced manufacturing jobs. We have a lot of those type of jobs with BMW and Michelin and here for advanced manufacturing. And so we really put a heavy emphasis on students going into career or trade type jobs. And so we have a very robust career center network in our school district where kids can actually go and come out of high school with a welding certificate and go out and immediately make, $70,000, $89,000 in the trade. So I think now that conversation has shifted where I'm not saying college is not important, but it's now more of an equal opportunity of, look, you've got two paths you can go. If you enjoy working, with your hands in the trade side, you can go that way, even if it's initially. A lot of our kids went out, they started in the trade industry. They did that for a couple of years, and they actually wanted to go back to go to college and actually get an advanced degree for advancement purposes. So I fully agree with Commissioner Carter's reasoning there, or ideas there, that I think nowadays the trade, and that's where a lot of the job vacancies are right now too. I think that's hugely important for a lot of local communities that they have the workers to be able to put in those jobs that are open.
Yeah, and I'm also curious to ask you about how do you think employers today should look at other educational experiences other than a 4-year degree and really diversify how they value resumes and a lived experience in addition to formal training. How important do you think it is for employers to have diversified, viewpoints when it comes to diversifying their workforce? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with you. I think that a lot of times now, education a couple of years ago really started at companies really requests and demands. And I think you'll see more of this in the next couple of years in K-12s particularly, is really looking at micro-credentialing and some of those skills that you can put a credential to where it's not necessarily a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree that's coming out of college. I think those are getting harder to come by in some cases. Some kids feel like for a lot of reasons that's out of reach in today's climate. I know a lot of our kids we work with in Greenville, my last district, they never saw themselves being able to go to college, whether it be affordability or whatever reason it happens to be. So I think in the next couple of years, a lot of colleges are also doing micro-credentialing, but I think you're going to see more of the micro-credentialing coming out of K-12 where kids can come out of high school with an Adobe credential or with a Microsoft credential in different areas, and that's recognized by Microsoft or Google or Adobe or whoever it happens to be, to go out and get those jobs right out of high school, and then hopefully again advance education, whatever it looks like past that.
Yeah, and Jeff, you talked earlier about the advancement of AI in education, and I wanted to give you the floor and to talk about the importance of using AI as a competitive advantage to give more kids an opportunity to succeed in education. What are your thoughts on striking the appropriate balance between artificial intelligence and traditional education? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
So it's funny you say that. So we just wrapped up our National Council of Innovative Technology Leaders in October, and the topic of that conversation was actually AI readiness, AI in schools, and what does that look like? What should we be teaching students about artificial intelligence? I think if you talk to most, at least in my experience, talking to a lot of companies, about what they're looking for with workforce. They're hiring a lot of folks that need AI experience. And so right now, I think our challenge in education is actually figuring out how do we do that safely? To your point, how do we balance to make sure kids are learning the skills they have to have? Because we know that AI technically can do that. But there are skills that kids still need to learn so that they can evaluate the AI responses, for example. And so I think right now there's a lot of districts that are working through AI literacy guides and AI literacy for what that's going to look like for their students. I know Chicago Public has an amazing AI literacy guide they just released. Has become one of the models for the country. And, those types of things, what we're grasping onto is to kind of look at how do we all build this out to make sure, to your point, all of our kids, regardless of whether they're in Greenville or San Antonio or Chicago, all of our kids have the same competitive advantage when it comes to applying for jobs out in the workforce in 2, 3, 5, 6 years that we know is probably going to be even more AI dominated than it already is.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, I'm interested in the transition to leadership development principles and, how it relates to system level sort of transformation. What do you think educators, administrators, and parents need to know surrounding this topic, my friend?
Yeah, so I think that system level transformation is one of the topics also that we're talking about in the National Council of Innovative Instructional Leaders that we've been working on for the last 2 years, actually. And you mentioned it, you alluded to it earlier, there's a teacher shortage out there right now. There's also, a lot of times it's not as much talked about, but there's a principal shortage. There's a leadership shortage, quite frankly, at the school level and the district level. We're seeing that pipeline deficit across multiple areas of education, not just teachers. And so we know that the teacher, by research, we've had decades of research on the teacher being the most impactful person on a student's achievement. They're the ones with the child all day and what they teach and how they teach. But the Wallace Foundation released studies 3 years ago or 4 years ago on the second most important person is the principal on student achievement. So when it comes to transformation at the building level, the principal is the one that leads that building. They should be the instructional leader in that building. And that's really where true transformation takes place. I can point you to multiple principals in both San Antonio and in Greenville and multiple districts around the country that are amazing transformational leaders because they're great instructional leaders. I think, what parents need to know about the process, I think that, and educators too, to a degree, is that it can be a slow process. It's not something that happens in 1 year. Transformation doesn't occur in 1 year. It's something that's done over time. That 2-3 year mark where you're going to get some of those results. Exceptional leaders can get that in 1 year. Again, I have examples of that around the country, but for the most part, that's going to be a 2-3 year journey to truly turn around a school that might be truly underperforming.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'm fascinated to ask you about educational burnout for teachers because, as we alluded to earlier, teachers are asked to wear many hats, work many hours, and not for a lot of money. So, as a former district leader and your current role, my friend, I'm curious your thoughts on strategies around how we can limit the amount of burnout that teachers and administrators are feeling today. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, so I think, you have to control what you can control. I think, we were always kind of transparent with our principals and our teachers to say when we had to do something, some of those things came down from the state or came down from the federal that we didn't have a choice to do. And it wasn't necessarily a district decision. It was something that the state required or the federal required. And so, we always tried to be transparent about that when that was the case, that we have to do this. And then also look at how do we take some things off. I think we talked a little bit about AI before, but, a couple years ago, teachers in our district were very, they were using an AI tool that was free and then it became paid. And teachers really came and said, look, this tool's saving us 6, 8, 9 hours a week. Is there any way we can, continue using this? And so, that's when the district looked at purchasing that tool for, quite frankly, a fairly not that expensive, honestly, in a district our size, that we were able to give back to teachers where teachers could get, if they're using it and they're using it effectively, they could get 6 to 9 hours of time back a week for kind of saving on those administrative and menial tasks that, quite frankly, had to be done, but AI can do. And so I think districts now have the ability to look at, what AI tools with guardrails and with guidance, protecting student privacy, what can you use to really help your teachers gain back that time, particularly, we can't always take some of those responsibilities off that are required by state, by federal, or even by district that, quite frankly, gets us student achievement results. But how do we actually find ways to help mitigate some of those, menial tasks, if you will, those administrative tasks teachers have to do?
And I know in your current role, Jeff, you talk a lot about and have a lot of conversations about thought leadership around educational topics of today. So I'm curious, when you're on the front lines talking to teachers, administrators, and other educational professionals, what sort of discussions are you having to sort of advance the future of education, my friend? What are your thoughts there? And what are educators across the country telling you today, my friend?
So in my current role as Chief Education Officer here at ERDI, we work primarily with superintendents, senior leaderships, chief academic officers, chief technology officers, and superintendents. The topics top of mind from them, coming up from their teachers, coming up from their principals, three topics that we actually, I think, already mentioned, but one being transformation. How do we work with those schools that may be still underperforming, or work with student groups that may be underperforming? How do we put supports and processes in place so that they can achieve? AI would be the other topic. I can't go anywhere where AI is not coming up as a topic. How do we use it? How do we use it safely, responsibly, ethically? Those things are all stuff that educators, superintendents, CTOs, CAOs are grappling with right now. And also resilient leadership. You mentioned the pipeline shortage. One of the things that's come up in our last survey when we surveyed our members across the country was the fact that there are leadership, vacancies, and in many cases they're struggling to fill those vacancies. So they're putting people sometimes in positions that they're not quite ready for. And so how do we very quickly support them and coach them so they can be great in that position? So that's a lot of the work that we do at ERDI, is really how do we continue to provide that professional learning? How do we provide those experiences for leaders so that they can continue to grow and be better at the jobs that they have in their districts?
And Jeff, we both mutually brought it up multiple times in our discussion. So I'm curious, what do you think it's going to take to attract, qualifying professionals to consider a career in teaching? Considering all of the demands on teachers today, what do you think districts around the country and we can all do to continue to attract qualifying professionals to go into education and teaching? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Well, I think one of the things I will say is that, sometimes we can be our own worst enemy sometimes. I think that, one of the things when I was in Greenville a couple of years ago, our own teacher forum, we had a teacher forum group that met regularly. And one of the things they were passionate about was just that topic, was how do we attract educators to the field? And one of the things they really honed in on was how do we really paint education and teaching particularly as one of those rewarding experiences? Like you said, people looking at salary, a lot of times are like, why would I go into the education and make that? But there's a lot of other pieces behind that. The teachers will tell you, most people go into it for the impact they're making on students' lives. And so our teacher forum did a whole campaign around really what it means to be a teacher and how to really project that, if you will, or market it in a positive light, because sometimes it's marketed in a very negative light. We also started in Greenville a future teacher academy. So we started in high school really with students who were interested in the education field, actually getting them into courses so that they could graduate high school with multiple credits towards an education degree. I think they have like 300 or 400 kids in the pipeline as of today right now that are now interested in becoming educators. And they achieve that because they allow those students to go into other schools and work with kids at a younger age and really got a passion for helping kids themselves. And so I think districts have to be creative. I think we actually can't wait until college to recruit students. I think you have to recruit your own students. You have to recruit your high school students that are in school right now and paint the picture of why education is an attractive field and the benefits of becoming a teacher.
Yeah, and Jeff, as I'm sure you know, yesterday was the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. And as you know, Jeff, I was born with cerebral palsy, and I've dedicated even a large portion of my adult life to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only in employment, but also in education. So I'm curious, Jeff, to ask you about eliminating barriers for students with disabilities, because, once they turn 18 or 21, they're often shipped off and told to figure it out on their own, and if they don't have the infrastructure to succeed after the structured supports are gone, a lot of these students can get lost into a system that wasn't really designed for them to succeed after the supports are gone. So I'm fascinated to ask you both from a personal and professional standpoint. How do you think we can eliminate barriers to access for students with disabilities to have a fulsome and regular, as much as possible, education experience, my friend?
So I have to give some credit to, my assistant superintendent of special education when I was in Greenville, Tracy Hogan. One of the things that she was kind of the mantra that she always carried was that all students are general education students first. And I think that really does frame the conversation differently. To your point, students who may be diagnosed with a disability, a lot of times, obviously, they're going to receive classes that are, or special education classes aside from their core instruction, meant to be a scaffold, meant to be tier 2, tier 3 to kind of help them, to your point, gain those skills they need. Hopefully that we can, help them become more self-sufficient as they go through elementary, middle, and high school, so they can be self-sufficient as adults as well. But I think that we have to kind of look at removing those barriers. We have to, in our own systems, we have to have better communication structures. The schools that I was in where students with disabilities thrived, the special education teacher, the general education teacher were very much in sync with each other. They talked regularly, they communicated regularly, so that when you went from a general education core class to a special education class, it wasn't disconnected. So they were working on those things that the students were struggling with and in helping to remove, hopefully, some of those barriers. I also think that we have to not treat support as an add-on. I think we have to treat support as the default. If I know I have certain students in my class that are going to struggle because I know their disability, let's pre-plan that. So when we're in our professional learning community and we're planning our lessons, and I know that Kevin's going to struggle with something, then I have the ability right then and there to go ahead and plan a support for him. And so being proactive in that support can greatly reduce the barriers I think the students sometimes face, particularly in their core classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff, just before I move on to my next topic, I wanted to share a quick story about how I got into this work and why this work is important. So, Jeff, when I was 9 years old, I found out that I wouldn't walk for the duration of my life because of the severity of my cerebral palsy, and I found that out the day before I had to start my 4th grade year of elementary school. And I share that story with you because, it was my middle school principal in my 4th grade. I attended Southwood Public School here in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And, the day before that I had to go back to school, I was in the hospital conference room. And so, Jeff, when I was a little guy, I went through 7 surgeries for my disability, and at the end of my 7th surgery, the doctor came into the conference room and he said to me that this surgery was a success, but I have one other thing to tell you, and that one other thing is that we've done everything that we can for you medically, and before they discharged me, they looked me in the face and told me I would never walk for the duration of my life. So the next day I had to start my 4th grade year of elementary school, and I credit my middle school principal, Jeff, for giving me sort of the trajectory of positivity in my life, because she called me down to her office. Her name was Dr. Carol Krulin. Dr. Krulin's office was very small, but she had everyone assigned to my file in her office that day, from social workers to teachers. My parents were also there, and she had a space in the middle of her office for my wheelchair. And I went through the story of what Dr. Karen, who was my orthopedic surgeon at the time, had told me the previous day. And of course, Dr. Crowley already knew that. And she looked at me after I finished regurgitating the story, and she said to me, the only limitations on your life are the artificial ones that you place on yourself personally. And ever since then, Jeff, I view that as one of the turning trajectory points of my life. So I'll give you the floor to just tell me about the positive impact that you see that teachers and administrators make every day, because sometimes they don't realize the impact of their reach. And I was just curious to get your general thoughts on the impact of the general reach of teachers and administrators, because sometimes it goes beyond sometimes what they can comprehend. Would you agree with that?
Totally agree with that. And I think, Kevin, sometimes it's, and I'm sure for your case and your principals and your teachers, sometimes that's very delayed, that you get to see that impact. It's not always immediate. I would say my own self, I was probably 15 years, I think, out of the classroom. My own self, when I was in an airport and somebody was calling my name, and I turned around, it ended up being one of my parents. I had taught a kid 15 years ago, and she was telling me about how he was a doctor, and he sparked his passion for being a doctor when we did this project in my class. It was a STEM project that we were working on that really, she said, encouraged him, or that he really realized that he could do the work, and he was a gifted class that I was teaching at the time. That he could do the work and he could, excel in that. And so that was 15 years later. So a lot of times I think teachers don't get that instant implication of how much they've impacted a student's life in that. And so, it's very rewarding. I think once you get past that first, second, third year of teaching, that's when you start getting some of those impactful experiences of parents and teachers or students coming back and saying, wow, you really made an impact on my life. And I think that's also a great, message to teachers that you are impacting students' lives negatively or positively, hopefully positively. And so you have to always be aware, to your point, that the teachers that told you, or principal, that your own limitations is what you put on yourself and that. And I will say this too, Kevin. I think kudos to you. I think a lot of our kids today, students with disabilities today too, I think need to see examples of that, because I think, to your point, a lot of students don't think they can do something because of maybe the limitation they have or they believe they have on themselves. And so I think seeing people who are successful like yourself, who have removed those limitations, so to speak, or have overcome those challenges, I think has a huge impact on our students, all students, but particularly with students with disabilities who need those role models to see, oh, I can do this, I can do that. Look at Kevin, he's done this, and I have cerebral palsy like he does. So I think I love your example and I love your enthusiasm for what you've accomplished. And you are a role model yourself, even though you're not a teacher. You're a role model for many kids out there that may be struggling with the same thing you did.
Well, Jeff, I have to push back just a little bit. I think that we're all teachers in our own life, because no matter how many degrees you have on a wall, you can always learn something from someone else, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, my friend. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on what it means to be an education solution provider today, and what it really means to you to provide solutions rather than lament problems in education. Because I think sometimes the goal gets lost in the cloud, so to speak, because of people getting discouraged or trying things that don't work. But I'm curious to you, what does it mean to be an education solution provider today, my friend?
So when I was in my role as associate superintendent, one of the things I looked for when I was purchasing products, first of all, of course, is solving a problem in practice. Like, what problem was I trying to solve with the product I was trying to purchase? But secondly, then I always looked for solution providers who would actually become partners. I was always looking for partners, not just something that would buy a tool or buy a hardware or software. I was actually looking for solution providers who would ultimately become partners with us. And what that really means is not just coming in, selling me a product and seeing them every 6 months or once a year when they wanted me to re-up the membership. It was really just checking in regularly, asking me how things were going, problem solving when we weren't getting the gains for a software we purchased that we should have been getting, helping to problem solve of why is that? Is it implementation issues? What was the problem? So for me, and one of the things we do at ERDI as well is really coach those solution providers and help those solution providers become district partners, not just go in and sell a product, but actually how do you add value beyond your product to a district or to a community?
Yeah, and Jeff, I know that one of your passions, my friend, is really coming up with solutions to problems, as I said, but it's also contributing to the future design of education, the future implementation of education. So I'm curious why the future of education is so important to you, and why designing systems and procedures to address some of those issues has so much of your passion, my friend. What are your thoughts then?
Well, I think my passion for education, of course, went into education as a teacher. That was what I always wanted to do, even when I was young. 5 years old, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And so, as I moved up from teaching into the various administration roles around that, one of the things, and I don't have children of my own, but one of the things that, I think we all have to recognize, whether we have children or not, is truly, as cliche as it may sound, the children we have in our schools today, they are our future. So regardless of whether you have a kid in school or whether you have kids at all, the students that are in our schools today are going to run the world someday. And so how do we best prepare them to make sure that they are prepared to take over for us in the current generation? So for me, that passion comes from knowing, because I did it firsthand, our team did it firsthand in Greenville. We know students can succeed. We know students in poverty can succeed. We've done it. We've beat some of those odds in Greenville that, a lot of people struggle with, particularly with students in poverty who have a lot of challenges sometimes. But we know that they can be successful if we put the right supports and we put the right structures in place. We've closed equity gaps with students with disabilities over the last 10 years. We continue to close those gaps. We close racial gaps of achievement. So we know with the right structures and what the research says, if we put those things in place, we actually can make sure that our students are successful. So my passion comes from, making sure our kids are prepared for that, college or career, whatever they decide to do right after high school.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'm curious to get your thoughts on findings from NPR and Brookings that found that they went back and they looked at a pre-pandemic both versus a post-pandemic, and some of their findings talked about the achievement gap between black and white students, for example, and it found that black students were further behind their white counterparts, particularly in 8th grade math, which they saw a widening gap of between 35 points in 2020, and now it's up to 42 points for black students when it comes to math and other test scores. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how we can work on shrinking the achievement gap and providing more resources to Title I schools, for example, where most of these students rely to get their education. And I'm curious about how you think we can approach closing the achievement gap, my friend. What are your thoughts there?
So I love the fact, Kevin, that you mentioned that and that you talk about the gaps in there. So one of the things I think every district does or should be doing is analyzing their own district data, because every community is very unique. When we looked at our data when I first got into the role as associate superintendent before I retired, looking at that data, we saw some similar disparaging data, not quite that extreme, I would say, between our students. More it was Black, Hispanic, and white for us. It was the makeup of the majority. We're almost a third in our district. That's probably changed a little bit now. But one of the things we did, and I always encourage districts, is really dive into the data and know how to look at your data. Sometimes you can jump to conclusions that really aren't accurate. So you mentioned the Title I schools. And so what you just mentioned was actually very true for us. when we started looking at our students who were not performing, we started looking at those student groups that weren't performing. Really, one of the things they had in common was they were low socioeconomic schools. So they were students in poverty. So it wasn't for us as much in Greenville, at least, and this could be different from district to district, but in Greenville, it wasn't as much the racial gap of achievement as much as it was the poverty, the have, if you will, and the have not. So it was the poverty versus the non-poverty. And so one of the successes that we were able to achieve in Greenville was through our transformation model was actually being able to close that achievement gap from poverty to non-poverty. And as a result, also started closing some of those racial gaps and also some of the students with disabilities gaps. Because poverty for us was that trend line or that through line that was the commonality of students who were not achieving. And of course, it wasn't their fault. And I would say the pandemic, you talked about the pandemic, we know for our students in poverty, they were at a huge disadvantage. In many cases, those were the parents of those students there that had to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs. They had to keep going to work because they were in those types of industry jobs that required you to be in person. So they didn't have the benefit of having a parent at home all the time, helping them with their student schoolwork and going through helping them if they needed help. And so it makes sense that those students fell a little further behind because they didn't have the right supports in place that they needed. So, I always encourage people, though, look beyond. I don't know that the NPR piece, particularly, couldn't find as much granular data as I would like to have found on that. But I always encourage people to look, dive deep into the data, look at poverty, look at racial, look at students with disabilities. But you have to look across all student groups to really determine the problem that you're trying to solve.
And you bring up an important point because the socioeconomic sort of factors contribute to a child's ability to learn, especially if you come from unstable homes. Your attention will be diverted, my friend. So I'm curious to ask you about cultural diversity, socioeconomic factors, and how that really plays a part in a child's success or failure as they go through the education system. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
So I think that's one of the things that districts have to really grapple with. That's one of the things we really had to look closely at, particularly with our students in poverty. As you know, students in poverty, at least again in our district, a lot of times they were the ones that were very transient. So they bounced from school to school sometimes. So one of the very first things we had to do was put in place for our students was we had to put in pacing guides across our district to make sure that our teachers were teaching the same thing at the same time. So that if you move from school A to school B, you weren't missing entire gaps of curriculum instruction because that school decided to do a different pacing. And so one of the other things I also looked at when I was looking at our students with our students in poverty was for many of those students who bounce sometimes from school to school, that sometimes could take a week to 2 weeks before they re-enrolled in another school. So if you think about that, if they do that 2 or 3 times in a year, some students could miss up to 6 weeks or more of school just because they were transitioning from school to school because the family maybe had to move because of finances or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's things that districts have to look at, and how do we mitigate those problems? How do we make it safe for example, we have a big Hispanic population. How do we make it safe and inviting for our Hispanic parents to come into school? Maybe they don't speak the language. They don't always feel comfortable coming into school. And so how do we mitigate that so that they do feel comfortable coming in and being a part of their child's education? So to your point, I think districts have to identify their problems of practice, if you will. And if we identify that students with disability, students in poverty have large gaps of achievement, how do we start looking at closing those gaps? What things can we put in place to help close those achievement gaps? And that will be different from district to district. But it is, again, if you look at the Greenville and San Antonio and some of the school districts around the country, it's possible to do it, and we are seeing it happen in districts across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, I've got 3 questions left for you, and the first of these 3 questions is this. If I made you the Secretary of Education for a day, what's the one thing across all districts you would hope would be universal, but isn't, that you would change if I made you Secretary of Education for the day?
Well, I think this is probably a big ask there, Kevin, but I really do think that our accountability systems in the country have to be looked at. I think that many times is holding us back on innovation. I think they're a little antiquated in some cases. That's not to say we abandon accountability. I'm a huge advocate for accountability. I think parents have to know what their kids are learning. I think they have to know the progress that their kids are making towards those viable skills and those critical skills when they leave college and high school. But for me, that's one of those things that I think our country will have to address in the next couple of years, particularly with AI, is really our accountability systems. Is that test at the end of the year that our kids take once a year, should that really determine their knowledge for the entire year, particularly if they have a bad test day or had a bad day at home, and so therefore they had a bad test score. And so I think that our assessment system is a little out of date from where we are in a country today, particularly where it comes to some of the innovations in technology that we have. So when you talked about skills, AI skills, and some of those skills kids are going to need in the future, I'm just not so sure our state standardized tests these days actually measure the types of skills we need to measure as kids are going out into college and career.
Yeah, and Jeff, you sparked my interest to ask one final follow-up question before I get to my last question. And that is this. I'm curious about your thoughts on the investment into children. And what I mean by that is, how important do you think it is for everyone to be rowing in the same boat, whether it becomes parents or educators or administrators? Because for children to succeed today, we all have to be invested in the process as well as the outcome, my friend. So how important do you think it is to be invested in the kids that we put through the educational system, and parents specifically? How important is it for them to be invested in their child's progress throughout school, my friend? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it's extremely important. I think, we see that trend kind of it declines a little bit as you go elementary, middle, high school. The parent involvement kind of declines a little bit as you go into middle and high school. It's understandable to a certain degree because, of course, you want to be able to give your kids some independence, and you also need to start weaning them off of some of that parent oversight because if they're going to college or they're going to work right after high school, they need to have some of that independence. But I think I was fortunate to work in a district that our parents were very involved in their students' education. And I think that's critical for our students to be successful, whatever that looks like. It's going to look like different ways for different parents based on the student and the student's abilities and, how much support they need. That will look a little different. But I think parent involvement is critical. And I also think community involvement is critical. Again, we had a great community that was very involved. I think regardless of whether you have children in school or not, that you have a stake in the current students that are in school. There again, you're going to be hiring them if you own a business in a couple of years. They're going to be taking care of you as you get older in the hospital systems. And so I think all of us have a vested interest in kids being successful in their school.
Yeah, and Jeff, I want to end on a positive note. I could talk to you for another 2 hours, but I'll spare you my inquiries to this final question. I want to end on a positive note. What excites you about the future of education, and how do you want your legacy to be defined as it relates to being an innovative educator and an educator of impact, my friend? So how do you want your career to impact the future of education, and what has you most excited about the future of how we're educating our kids today?
So I think I think a lot of, even parents, but certainly community, a lot of times they don't get the benefit that I had of being able to, and still today get to be of being in classrooms and seeing kids in classrooms and teachers in action today. We have brilliant students in our education system today. We have students that are solving world problems in many cases in some of our schools when they're through the project-based learning things that they have going on. So I think for me, the passion or my legacy has always been around how do we ensure that all students have the same access to education And again, it doesn't mean necessarily college, but how they have access to the education to set them up for success in career or college. And so for me, my legacy, like I said, I just retired from Greenville. I think for me, the proudest moments of my last days in Greenville was watching schools that had been historically underperforming perform. That wasn't me doing that work in that schools. I certainly had a part in that as far as some of the initiatives and structures we put in place. But being able to see our leaders that we trained, being able to put that training and skills to use in their schools and actually improve student achievement, improve outcome for students. For me, that was some of my proudest moments. And while other people may not see me and look at me and associate me with that, that's more of an internal thing for me that I know I made an impact on not only just the principals and teachers, but ultimately made an impact on the students in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Jeff, tell me, if people want to get connected with you, what's the best way they can do that?
So I am on LinkedIn is probably the best way. I'm on LinkedIn at McCoy GCS. On LinkedIn. That's pretty much the biggest social media platform that I use right now.
Fabulous. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for your commitment to making education more equitable for a wider swath of students, and for your obvious passion and commitment to the profession, my friend. If we had more educators like you, we would have more prosperity in education, my friend. So I want to thank you for your obvious commitment and passion in the field, and for joining me to engage in conversation. It's most appreciated.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.